just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. So whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate, and they died. But the one who eats this bread will live forever. He said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. When many of his disciples heard this, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" But Jesus, being aware that his disciples were complaining about it, said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But among you there are those who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the first who were the ones who did not believe, and who was the one who would betray him. And he said, "For this reason I have told you, that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father." Because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. And so Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also wish to go away?" Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
We've all been there, either in our own lives or in the lives of loved ones. We get really excited about something new, something that energizes us, and it helps us to look at things from a new perspective. Maybe it's a new cause that we've become involved in, or a new job or school venture, or even a new relationship. Whatever it is, we are all in. Until we hit a wall. Suddenly, the reality of what we're involved in starts to sink in. The hours, the commitment, the sacrifice, the change that this will require in our lives. We begin to see that this new thing is much more complicated than we initially thought. We begin to question whether the cost is too much, the sacrifice too high. This is what we see at the end of our gospel lesson today. We see Jesus' followers making a decision about whether to leave or to stay with him. Even today, Jesus' teachings are difficult for us to understand, and that's with over 2,000 years of history and tradition, commentaries and sermons, and great teachers to try to explain them to us. Jesus' teachings were radical in his own day, and we see over and over again in the Gospels, in the other writings of the New Testament, and in early Christian writings that the earliest followers were confused about how to interpret some of Jesus' teachings. Today we find one such passage that demonstrates this confusion, and we're told that at the end of it, many of Jesus' followers turned back and no longer went with him. As he watched people walk away, I imagine Jesus feeling pangs of disappointment, but also some resolve. Jesus operated with a high degree of what psychologists call self-differentiation, which simply means acknowledging that we are only ever responsible for our own feelings and our own actions. Jesus spoke the truth, and he invited people to follow him, but he never forced anyone to come with him. He taught and preached and healed people openly, regardless of how the crowds around him responded. Following Jesus has always been voluntary. It's a choice made on the part of the disciple. As Jesus watched many of those in the crowd turn back and walk away from him, he turned toward his 12 disciples, his closest friends, and asked, "Do you also wish to go away?" There are many different voices that we can give to Jesus' question. We could imagine him speaking it out of anger, out of resentment or sadness, weariness or despair. And his voice could have carried any of those connotations. We honestly don't know based on what is printed. But I wonder too if his voice may have been neutral. A simple question. Do you also wish to go away? If so, you can leave at any point. Again, Jesus never forced any of his followers to stay with him. Imagining Jesus' question as an open invitation makes Peter's response all the more powerful. Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. Peter's words are loaded with significance. As with Jesus' question, Peter's response can be read with varying different tones or emotions. To whom can we go could be said out of a sense of desperation or feeling trapped. We're in too deep now, so we might as well just stick with you. But what follows makes that tone very unlikely. Peter's question is followed by a statement of faith, and thus the tone that I imagine sounds more along the lines of, we know this isn't going to be easy, and sometimes it is going to be downright hard, but we choose you. The disciples chose Jesus. They chose Jesus over their careers. They left the work that they were doing to follow him. They chose Jesus over their families. We know that at least some of the disciples were married, and presumably some had children. While they surely came home at some points in their journey, they also were on the road a lot. And after Jesus' death and resurrection, we know that many of his disciples traveled far and wide to spread his message. And finally, they chose Jesus over their own lives. Many of them died as a result of following Jesus and spreading his teachings and word of his resurrection. To whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. Peter and the others saw in Jesus the answer to their prayers. They heard in him the words of eternal life, and they believed him, even if sometimes they struggled to understand him. They believed that he was, in fact, the Holy One of God, the long-awaited Messiah. Peter's declaration, presumably on behalf of the rest of the disciples, is powerful. It's an affirmation that they choose to stay with Jesus, regardless of what happens, and that despite their sometimes confusion, they do have a pretty good idea of who Jesus really is. Today, I'd like to challenge each of us to spend time with these verses. These verses are often used in prayer. Imagine you and Jesus having the same dialogue. Tell him your struggles and your doubts, your confusion. And let Jesus ask you the question, do you also wish to go? Listen to your heart's response and pray with that response. Be honest with Jesus. He can take it. Whatever you think and feel, he can handle it, I promise. And then reflect on Peter's response and ask if this is true for you too. Have you come to believe that Jesus has the words of eternal life? What does that mean to you? Have you come to believe and know that he is the Holy One of God? What does that mean to you? These are all fruitful questions for prayer and reflection as we go through our upcoming week. So use these verses, pray with them honestly, and dialogue with Jesus. And in doing so, deepen your relationship with the living Christ.